The rain in the city didn't just fall. It punished. It slicked the cracked asphalt of the forgotten avenues, turning the harsh neon reflections into jagged pools of bleeding light. Vivian Montgomery ran through the downpour, her breath a ragged, desperate sound, echoing like a broken rhythm against the heavy, rolling thunder. She did not care about the biting cold. She did not care that the heavy silk of her white bridal gown was torn completely at the hem. Dragging through the black grease and grime of an alleyway she wouldn't have dared drive past a mere 2 hours ago. All she knew was terror, the raw, suffocating terror of what she had left behind. Just 90 minutes ago, she had been standing beneath a glittering crystal chandelier in the grand ballroom of the Montgomery estate. Her father, Arthur Montgomery, had stood before 300 of the city's most powerful elites, raising a crystal flute of vintage champagne, smiling that cold, transactional smile of his, presenting her to the crowd like a prized possession won at an auction. He had toasted to her future, a future that had been systematically sold to Julian Vance, a man whose polished public image masked a predatory, calculating sadism. It wasn't a marriage. It was a corporate merger, a hostile takeover with her life, and her freedom serving as the ultimate collateral. When the music had swelled, Julian had pulled her onto the dark terrace, his fingers tightening around her wrist with a bruising force, signaling absolute ownership. He had leaned close, his breath hot against her ear, whispering how he intended to strip away her defiance, how he would bend her to his will the moment the rings were exchanged. In that second, looking at his smug, cruel face, something fundamental inside Vivian snapped. The pristine, obedient persona she had maintained for 24 years shattered. She had slipped past the distracted security detail at the edge of the terrace, broken a rusted latch on a side conservatory door, and run headfirst into the dark, punishing storm without looking back. Have you ever experienced something similar? Tell us your story in the comments. Now, her chest burned with an agonizing fire. Her lungs screamed for oxygen with every frantic step. Behind her, the sharp, distinct sound of tires screeching on wet pavement echoed through the narrow brick corridor. The sound sent a jolt of pure adrenaline straight to her heart. They were hunting for her. She knew exactly how her father's mind worked. Arthur Montgomery would not tolerate the public humiliation of a runaway bride. His men, alongside Julian's private security task force, would already be locking down the transit stations. They would be searching the luxury boutique hotels, scanning the perimeter of her friends' high-rise apartments, tracking her digital footprint. But she had left her phone, her purse, and her identification sitting on the vanity of her bridal suit. She had absolutely no money, no connections left who wouldn't immediately betray her location to her father. Nowhere left to run. Up ahead, through the heavy curtain of falling water, a flickering, rusted sign cast a dim, amber glow over the slick pavement. It buzzed with a low, mechanical hum, the faded lettering reading Sauvier-Eignaauto. It was a gritty, old-school garage, the kind of establishment that belonged to a bygone era of heavy industry. The brick facade was stained with decades of soot. The large concrete entrance floor was dark with embedded motor oil. One of the massive, rusted iron rolling bay doors was lifted halfway up, throwing a sharp wedge of stark tungsten light into the black, rain-soaked alley. Desperate, her vision blurring from exhaustion and rain, Vivian ducked beneath the heavy metal door. The delicate lace of her soaked gown caught violently on the iron tracks, tearing further with a sharp rip. But she didn't pause. She stumbled forward into the heavy, oil-scented warmth of the workshop, her breath coming in shallow, terrified gasps. In the center of the main bay, leaning deep over the exposed, roaring engine block of a classic black muscle car, was a man. He did not look up immediately when she entered. He seemed completely absorbed in the mechanical anatomy before him, his large, powerful hands maneuvering a heavy steel socket wrench with a practiced, effortless precision. A precision that spoke of years of intense labor. He wore a fitted, oil-smudged black crew neck-tee shirt that clung tightly to his broad chest, emphasizing the heavy musculature of his shoulders. His dark gray, heavy-duty canvas work pants were slung low on his hips, held up by a thick leather tool belt that clanked softly as he moved. A thick layer of grease and charcoal dust smudged his sharp jawline, which was covered in a light, well-kept dark stubble. He looked entirely like a creature of muscle and iron. Rugged, immovable, and entirely out of place in Vivian's world of silk and silver. Vivian leaned her back against a tall stack of heavy rubber tires, her entire body trembling violently from a combination of shock, cold, and physical exhaustion. Her vivid emerald green eyes were wide, darting toward the open alleyway before locking onto the silhouette of the mechanic. "Please," she gasped out, her voice cracking, barely audible over the roaring engine and the pounding rain outside. "Please, you have to help me. I need to hide." The man stopped. The wrench in his hand froze against the steel bolt. Slowly, with a deliberate, unbothered calm, he turned his head. His intense, storm, gray eyes locked onto hers through the dim light of the garage. He didn't blink, and he didn't look shocked by the surreal sight of a drenched, aristocratic woman in a ruined wedding dress invading his workspace at midnight. He didn't drop his tools or offer a word of comfort. He merely stood up to his full, imposing height, well over 6 feet of raw, intimidating physical presence, and began wiping his grease-stained hands on a dark, tattered rag. "The theater district is 4 blocks over, lady," he said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone, an absolute rumble that vibrated through the quiet spaces of the garage, and seemed to ground the frantic energy in the room. "We don't do costume adjustments here, and we close at midnight. I'm not an actress," Vivian pleaded, stepping out from the shadows of the tire rack. Her white satin heels, now ruined and black with grease, clicked sharply against the hard concrete floor as she approached him. "My name is Vivian Montgomery. My father and Julian Vance. They are tracking me right now. They have security teams scouring every street in this district. If they find me, they will drag me back to that estate, and they will force me into a marriage that will destroy my life. I don't need money. I don't need a ride. I just need a place to hide. Just for tonight, until the search thins out." At the explicit mention of the name Vance, something subtle but incredibly violent shifted behind the man's storm, gray eyes. His gaze narrowed into a sharp, lethal focus. His jaw clenched so hard that a muscle ticked beneath the stubble on his cheek. A dangerous, guarded shadow crossing his face. He stepped fully into the stark tungsten light of the workshop, his massive frame completely eclipsing her smaller form, cutting off her view of the exit. "Montgomery," he repeated softly, his deep voice testing the weight of the name, stripping it of its societal power. He looked her up and down with an analytical, cold scrutiny. He noted the intricate, expensive French lace, the flawless diamonds dripping from her ears, and the genuine, unadulterated terror vibrating through her frame. "You're a very long way from the penthouse, princess. Around here, we don't get involved in the games of bored rich people. Your fiancé's family doesn't play nice, and neither does your father. I don't need that kind of trouble knocking on my door." "It's not a game!" Vivian cried out, her defense mechanisms crumbling into raw desperation. Before she could control her actions, she stepped directly into his personal space, her small, pale hands reaching out to grab the front of his oil-stained T-shirt. She clutched the rough fabric, her fingers trembling against the solid, unyielding warmth of his chest. "Please, I am begging you. I will do anything you ask. I will pay you whatever sum you want the moment I can safely access my own resources. Just, please don't let them take me back to him." Before the man could respond, the bright, aggressive sweep of high beam headlights cut through the rainy darkness of the alleyway. The distinct, low, expensive hum of a luxury SUV engine idled just outside the half-open garage door, its tires splashing heavily through the puddles. The shadow of the massive vehicle blocked the ambient light from the street. "They're here," Vivian whispered, her face draining of what little color it had left. Her grip on his shirt tightened in pure panic, her emerald eyes looking up at him as if he were her absolute last lifeline on earth. "Please." The mechanic looked from her terrified, pale face toward the shadow of the luxury vehicle, parking right outside his bay. A cold, unreadable expression settled over his rugged features, replacing his initial annoyance with a calculated, dangerous calm. He didn't run, and he didn't show an ounce of fear. Instead, he gripped her wrists. His touch was surprisingly firm, unyielding like iron, yet careful enough not to leave a mark on her delicate skin. He easily pulled her hands off his shirt and forced her back a step. "Stand behind the structural lift," he commanded in a low, authoritative whisper that brooked no argument. "Keep your mouth shut and stay out of the light." Vivian didn't hesitate. She threw her heavy silk train over her arm and ducked behind the thick, dark iron pillars of the heavy vehicle lift, pulling herself into the deepest shadows just as two large men in tailored black suits and earpieces stepped under the rolling garage door. Their eyes scanned the interior with the ruthless, mechanical efficiency of trained hunters, their handguns subtly shifting beneath their coats. The mechanic didn't move from his spot by the muscle car. He picked up his wrench, turned his back to intruders, and went right back to adjusting the engine, his posture completely relaxed, as if the world outside his garage didn't exist. "Hey," one of the security guards barked, his voice loud and demanding over the sound of the rain. "Man, we're looking for a woman. 24, dark hair, wearing a white wedding dress. She came down this alley. You see her." The mechanic slowly turned around, resting one hip against the quarter panel of the car. He looked at the two armed men with an expression of pure, unbothered boredom. "Does this look like a bridal boutique to you?" he asked, his voice flat, completely devoid of fear. "I'm working on a block. I don't look at the alley." The lead guard stepped further into the garage, his boots echoing loudly. He eyed the grease-stained floor, then looked sharply toward the closed office door at the back. "We have reason to believe she ran in here. Step aside, we're going to check the premises." "You have a warrant?" the mechanic asked, his tone dropping an octave, becoming suddenly quiet and incredibly dangerous. He didn't shift his stance, but the casual aura vanished, replaced by an aggressive, territorial weight. "Because unless you have papers signed by a judge, you don't take another step across that concrete line. This is private property. Get out of my shop." The second guard sneered, reaching into his jacket, his hand resting on the handle of his concealed firearm in an overt gesture of intimidation. "You don't know who we work for, pal. We're with Montgomery International Advanced Logistics. You don't want to make this difficult for yourself. Step aside, or we make you step aside." A low, humorless laugh escaped the mechanic's throat. He finally tossed the heavy steel wrench onto the metal workbench behind him. The loud, echoing clank of the iron tool seemed to puncture the tension in the room. He walked forward, stepping directly into the path of the lead guard. Up close, his physical dominance was undeniable. He towered over the security detail, his chest broad and unyielding. "I don't care if you work for the president," the mechanic whispered, his eyes turning into two pieces of cold, lethal flint. "If you don't pull your hand out of that jacket in the next 3 seconds, I'm going to use that hydraulic press over there to see how much pressure your wrists can take before they snap. Now, get out of my garage before I lose my patience." The two guards froze, They looked at the size of the man, the absolute lack of hesitation in his eyes, and the quiet certainty in his voice. They realized instantly that this wasn't a standard civilian they could easily bully. The lead guard took a slow step back, his eyes narrowing as he evaluated the risk. He adjusted his earpiece, glaring past the mechanic toward the shadows. But Vivian remained perfectly still, her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath held so tightly it pained her. "We'll be watching the area," the lead guard warned, his voice tight with controlled anger. "If we find out you're lying, or if you're hiding her, your little garage won't exist by tomorrow morning." "I'll be right here," the mechanic replied coldly. The two men backed out slowly, keeping their eyes on him until they disappeared beneath the rolling door. A moment later, the loud splash of tires signaled the luxury SUV accelerating down the alleyway, its headlights fading into the dark curtain of rain. The garage fell into a heavy, tense silence, broken only by the steady dripping of water from Vivian's soaked gown onto the concrete floor. The mechanic didn't turn around immediately. He stood at the entrance for a long moment, watching the street to ensure they were truly gone. Then, he turned sharply, his storm gray eyes cutting through the darkness directly to the shadow of the car lift where Vivian was hidden. "They're gone," he said simply. "For now." Vivian slid out from behind the heavy iron pillar, her legs so weak they felt like water. She collapsed slightly against the side of the muscle car, her hand gripping the cold metal for support. The sheer terror of the encounter had left her lightheaded, but as she looked at the man who had just risked his livelihood, and potentially his life, to protect a total stranger, a profound wave of relief washed over her. "Thank you," she whispered honestly, her emerald eyes locked onto his. "You don't know what you just did for me. They would have locked me away." "I didn't do it for you," the mechanic said coldly, walking over to his workbench and picking up a clean rag to wipe down his tools. "I did it because I don't like trespassers, and I like the people who employ those goons even less." He stopped, turning his head to look at her over his shoulder. "But those men aren't stupid. They'll realize this is the only dry building in a 3-block radius. They'll come back with more men, and they won't ask for permission next time." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Vivian asked, a hint of panic rising in her voice again. "I can't go to the police. My father has half the precinct on his payroll. I have no money, no phone. I'm trapped." The mechanic walked over to the rolling door, pulling the heavy chain to lower it completely to the floor, locking it into place with a loud metallic thud. The garage was now sealed, isolated from the storm and the hunters outside. He walked back to the center of the floor, standing right in front of her. The contrast between them was absolute. Her in ruined, high society luxury, him in the raw, gritty reality of the working class. He stared at her for a long, agonizing moment, his brilliant, calculating gray eyes analyzing every line of her face, as if solving a complex mathematical equation. "You said you'd do anything to escape that marriage," he said, his voice dropping into a low, deliberate tone that made the hairs on Vivian's arms stand up. "I meant it," Vivian said, her jaw tightening with newfound resolve. "Anything." "Good," the man said, a grim, unreadable smirk touching the corner of his lips. "Because I have a proposition for you, princess. You want a permanent shield against Julian Vance and your father. You want a reason that will legally bar them from ever forcing you into another contract." Vivian frowned, her breath catching in her throat. "What are you talking about?" The mechanic stepped closer, his shadow enveloping her completely. "My name is Leo Vance," he said, quietly, the revelation hitting the room like a physical blow. Vivian's eyes widened in absolute shock. But before she could speak, he continued. "And tomorrow morning, you and I are going to the city courthouse. If you want your freedom, princess, You're going to marry a mechanic." The name hung in the stagnant air of the garage, heavier than the scent of old grease and burnt gasoline. Leo Vance. Vivian's mind fractured, trying to force the pieces together. But they refused to fit. The Vances were high society. They were old money, corporate empires, and ruthless boardroom executioners. Julian Vance, the man she had just fled from, was a creature of pristine silk ties, manicured hands, and a hollow, tailored grin. Yet standing before her was a man who looked like he had been forged from the very iron of the car lifts. His hands were calloused, his skin marked by faint scars from slipping wrenches, and his eyes carried a dark, hardened cynicism that didn't belong in a penthouse. Leo Vance. Vivian breathed the name, stepping back until her spine pressed against the cold, unyielding metal of the hydraulic car lift. Her emerald eyes scanned his face, searching for a family resemblance, searching for a trap. Julian's brother. No, that's impossible. Julian is an only child. I've met his mother, Eleanor. I've seen the family tree. There is no mention of you, anywhere. Leo didn't flinch at the rejection of his name. He simply tossed the dirty rag onto a metal tray, the wet thud punctuating the silence. When you refuse to play the family game, Eleanor has a very efficient way of scrubbing the record, he said. His voice entirely flat, devoid of any self-pity or emotion. To the press, to the board, and to your father, Julian is the golden heir. But I am the eldest. And legally I still carry the name. More importantly, I carry a valid state identification that says so. He walked over to a rusted metal filing cabinet in the corner of the office doorway. With a sharp tug that made the metal groan, he pulled open the top drawer, reached into a battered leather wallet, and pulled out a hard plastic card. He flipped it through the air. It landed on the hood of the black muscle car between them. Vivian approached slowly, her ruined white gown rustling against the concrete. She picked up the card. It was a standard, state-issued driver's license. The face staring back from the photograph was a slightly younger, less weathered version of the man standing before her. But the name printed in crisp, black letters was unmistakable: Leonard Arthur Vance. Why? Vivian asked, her voice dropping to a whisper as she looked up from the card. Why is a Vance running a gritty auto shop on Sovereign Street? Why aren't you in a suit, destroying lives from a boardroom like the rest of them? Because I preferred the honesty of Greece over the filth of their money, Leo said, his storm, gray eyes darkening. He stepped closer, stepping into her space, until she had to tilt her head back to look at him. Julian and my mother think they've won. They think they've secured the ultimate merger with your father's logistics empire to completely control the shipping lines. But they forgot one tiny detail. I still hold a significant percentage of foundational shares. Shares that freeze if I marry without the board's consent. Or, conversely, shares that can be used to disrupt the entire merger if I align my legal status with a competing entity. Like the Montgomery bloodline. Vivian's sharp mind, trained from birth to understand the brutal architecture of corporate warfare, instantly grasped what he was proposing. A marriage of convenience, she murmured. If I marry you, my father's contract with Julian becomes legally void. A woman cannot be forced into an arranged marriage contract if she is already legally bound to another man. And because you are a Vance, the legal fallout would tie Julian's lawyers in knots for months. Exactly, Leo said, leaning his hip against the car's fender. It stops Julian from touching you. Your father can't drag a legally married woman back to an altar without a massive, public scandal that would destroy his stock value. It buys you time. It buys you protection. And what do you get out of this, Leo? Vivian asked, her green eyes narrowing with suspicion. Nobody risks the wrath of Arthur Montgomery and Julian Vance out of the goodness of their heart. What is your price? Revenge, Leo replied, the word leaving his lips with a cold, terrifying simplicity. Julian spent the last 5 years trying to prove he was better than me, trying to erase my existence so he could inherit the throne. I want to see his face when he realizes the woman he fought so hard to buy belongs to the brother he tried to bury. Vivian felt a shiver run down her spine. The absolute conviction in his voice was terrifying, but it was also the first real shield she had been offered in her entire life. For years, she had been a pawn, shifted across a board by her father's ambitions. Now, this rugged stranger was offering her a chance to become a player. There have to be rules, Vivian said, her voice stabilizing. The aristocratic authority she had been raised with bleeding back into her tone. She stood up straight, ignoring the damp chill of her gown. If we do this, it is a business arrangement. Nothing more. I wouldn't have it any other way, princess. Leo smirked, though his eyes remained entirely serious. Rule number 1, we share this space. You live in the apartment upstairs. It's small, it's loud, and it smells like motor oil. You don't complain. Agreed, Vivian said without hesitation. Rule number 2, this is a legal shield only. There is no physical aspect to this marriage. We are business partners executing a contract. Leo looked at her, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second on her parted lips, before shifting back to her green eyes. Don't worry, Montgomery. I don't touch high-maintenance runaways. Rule number 3, you work. Pop is getting old, and the garage invoices are a disaster. If you're going to hide here, you earn your keep. You don't sit around looking pretty in silk. I can handle a ledger. Vivian shot back, her pride flared. Rule number 4. The moment Julian Vance is neutralized and my father backs down, we file for a quiet, uncontested divorce. We dissolve the partnership, and we walk away with no strings attached. Deal, Leo said. He reached out his large, calloused hand. Vivian looked at his palm, smudged with black carbon, and then looked at her own pale, manicured hand. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his. His grip was warm, completely enveloping hers, firm and unyielding. It felt less like a promise of romance and more like a pact made in the trenches of a looming war. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, Leo said, releasing her hand and turning back toward the car engine. The courthouse opens early. We get the certificate before your father figures out you didn't leave the city limits. Now, go upstairs. The door at the back of the office leads to the flat. There's a clean shirt on the drying rack. Wash the mud off yourself. Vivian nodded, suddenly feeling the massive weight of physical exhaustion crashing over her. She turned and walked toward the small, dimly lit glass office at the back of the garage bay. As she opened the door, she looked back over his shoulder. Leo was already leaning back over the engine block, the steel wrench in his hand clicking against the bolts as if the last 15 minutes had been nothing more than a routine oil change. She climbed the narrow, creaking wooden stairs behind the office, each step groaning under her weight. The apartment above was exactly as he had described. Compact, functional, and utilitarian. A single mattress sat in the corner. A small kitchen counter held a single coffee pot, and a metal rack held a few changes of clothes. Vivian stripped away the heavy, ruined white silk of her bridal gown, letting the thousands of dollars of lace crumple onto the worn linoleum floor like a discarded skin. She put on the oversized black T-shirt Leo had mentioned. It smelled faintly of cedarwood and iron. She lay down on the hard mattress, staring up at the water-stained ceiling as the rain continued to lash against the glass window. She was no longer Vivian Montgomery, the prize heiress of the Upper East Hills. Tomorrow, she would be the wife of a grease-stained mechanic on Sovereign Street. Downstairs, the rhythmic, steady metallic clank of Leo's tools echoed through the floorboards. It was loud. It was heavy. But for the first time in her life, it was a sound that made her feel safe. Morning came without a sunrise, only a dull, leaden sky bleeding light through the grime of the apartment window. Vivian woke to the smell of strong, cheap coffee, and the sharp, synthetic bite of motor oil. Her body arched with an unfamiliar ache, the physical toll of running through a midnight storm in a 10-pound silk gown. She sat up on the thin mattress, looking down at the oversized black shirt that swallowed her frame. It was rough canvas cotton, a harsh contrast to the Egyptian cotton sheets she had spent her life tucked into. She pulled her legs to her chest, staring at the ruined wedding dress piled like a dead white bird on the linoleum floor. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a sudden downpour. She was hiding in a mechanic's loft on Sovereign Street, a street her father's company trucks routinely bypassed on their way to the shipping docks. From downstairs, a heavy, rhythmic thud echoed through the floorboards. The metal rolling doors were being hauled open for the day. The business of survival was beginning. Vivian stood up, her bare feet instantly freezing against the cold floor. She walked to the small bathroom sink. Splash after splash of icy water cleared the remaining panic from her eyes. Her face looked pale in the cracked mirror, but her green eyes held a sharp, lethal determination. She wasn't going back. Not to Arthur Montgomery's corporate auction block, and certainly not to Julian Vance's bruising grip. She found a pair of stiff, dark denim jeans and a faded red flannel shirt on the rack Leo had mentioned. They were both far too large, but she rolled the sleeves up to her elbows and tightened a scrap of rope around her waist. She looked ridiculous, an exiled princess masquerading as a dockhand. But she looked hidden, and right now, hidden was all that mattered. She walked down the creaking wooden stairs behind the office, every step groaning beneath her weight. When she stepped out into the main garage bay, the air was cold, crisp with the morning breeze cutting through the open rolling door. Leo was already there. He didn't look like a man who had barely slept 3 hours. He was leaning into the bed of an old Ford pickup truck, checking a suspension line. His charcoal black hair was damp from a quick wash. His gray eyes focused, cold, and entirely unbothered. "You're late," he said, without turning his head. His gravelly baritone boomed in the empty workspace. "It's 7:30. Vivian replied, her voice retaining its polished, high society clip. "Why leave for the courthouse in 10 minutes? Leo pulled himself out of the truck bed, tossing a heavy iron wrench into his toolbox. He looked at her, his storm, gray eyes lingering on the oversized clothes. A faint, almost imperceptible smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. "You look like a scarecrow, princess," he murmured. "I look like someone who doesn't want to be recognized by my father's spotters." Vivian snapped back, crossing her arms over her chest. "Fair enough," Leo said, wiping his hands on his canvas pants. "Let's get one thing clear before we step out that door." He walked over to her, his massive physical presence filling the small space between them. "The courthouse clerk is on my payroll for basic filings, but this certificate is real. The moment our names go on that document, you are legally a Vance. It means my family's mess becomes your shadow, and your father's hounds become my target. Are you ready for that, Vivian?" It was the first time he had used her name. The sound of it leaving his lips felt heavy, deliberate. Vivian looked up into his intense gray eyes, sensing the sheer, unyielding power behind them. "Julian Vance told me he would break me," she whispered. "My father told me I was nothing more than a signature on a logistics merger. I would rather face a war with your family, Leo, than spend another second as a slave to mine." Leo stared at her for a beat longer, validating the steel in her gaze. "Good," he said simply. "Let's go get married." They didn't take a luxury sedan. They took a battered, matte, black tow truck that smelled of tobacco and old vinyl. The drive through the city was a blur of gray buildings and flashing traffic lights. Vivian kept her head low, her eyes scanning every black SUV that pulled up beside them. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. But Leo drove with a calm, steady hand, weaving through the industrial backstreets with absolute confidence. The municipal courthouse was a drab, concrete monolith, entirely devoid of the marble pillars and white roses Vivian had envisioned for her wedding day. There were no photographers, no high society gossip columnists, no expensive catering crews, just a tired-looking clerk behind a scratched plexiglass window, and the dry mechanical click of a state-issued stamp. "Sign here," the clerk said, sliding a crisp white sheet through the slot. Vivian picked up the cheap plastic pen. Her hand didn't shake. With a few swift strokes, she wrote her name next to his. Leonard Arthur Vance. Vivian Montgomery Vance. The clerk pressed the heavy steel stamp down onto the paper. A sharp, definitive thud that shattered her old life into 1,000 unrecoverable pieces. "Congratulations," the clerk muttered, not looking up. Next, Leo picked up the official copy of the certificate, folded it neatly, and slid it into his heavy leather jacket. He turned to Vivian, his face unreadable. "It's done," he said. "The shield is active." Vivian took a deep, shaky breath, the weight of the realization crashing over her. She was a married woman, to a man she had met less than 12 hours ago. As they walked out into the cold morning air, a black sedan with tinted windows slowly cruised past the courthouse steps. The vehicle paused, its brake lights glowing red against the wet asphalt. Vivian froze, her hand instinctively reaching out to grab Leo's forearm, her fingers digging into the hard muscle beneath his sleeve. Leo didn't pull away. He stood entirely still, his massive frame shifting slightly to place himself between Vivian and the car, his hand resting casually near his heavy metal belt buckle. The sedan lingered for 5 agonizing seconds before its engine roared and it accelerated away into the morning traffic. Leo looked down at her hand on his arm. "They're scanning the government buildings," he murmured, his voice deadly serious. "Arthur's smart. He knows the legal loopholes as well as I do. He's going to realize what we did by noon. We need to get back to Sovereign Street. The real fight is about to start." The office of Montgomery International smelled of expensive leather, polished mahogany, and old, absolute power. Arthur Montgomery stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass window, looking down at the sprawling docks of the city harbor. His hands were locked behind his back, the heavy gold signet ring on his finger catching the dull morning light. Behind him, the door burst open with a violent slam. Julian Vance strode into the room. His immaculate navy blue pinstripe suit looked slightly wrinkled. His perfectly slicked, back dark brown hair had a few strands out of place. His hazel eyes were wild with a mixture of humiliated fury and corporate panic. "She's not at her apartment," Julian hissed, slamming his leather briefcase onto the mahogany desk. "She's not with her mother. She's not at the country club. My security detail has calmed every high rise from here to the harbor. Vivian has completely vanished. Arthur, do you have any idea what this is doing to our stock projection? The board is already asking questions about the merger signature." Arthur did not turn around. He remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a massive cargo ship clearing the dock. "Vivian is a child of privilege, Julian," Arthur said, his voice a cold, measured rasp. "She has never spent a night outside a luxury zip code in her entire life. She does not have the stamina for a real disappearance. She will crawl back the moment her lack of credit access sinks in." "She doesn't have credit access," Julian countered, stepping closer to the window. "Because I frozen her accounts 45 minutes ago. But that isn't the problem. The problem is that my spotters just pulled a registration log from the municipal courthouse." Arthur slowly turned around, his piercing, icy blue eyes locking onto Julian. The sudden, absolute silence in the room became heavy. What registration log? Arthur demanded. Julian pulled a folded thermal paper sheet from his jacket. His hand was trembling slightly with rage. A marriage license. Julian whispered, the words tasting like poison. Filed at 8:15 this morning. Vivian Montgomery is no longer legally single. Arthur's face did not move, but his jaw set into a block of hard stone. Who is the man? Arthur asked, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Did she run off with some tennis instructor? A driver. What can have the marriage annulled by midnight if the leverage is right? Julian swallowed hard, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. It's not a driver, Arthur. The name on the certificate. It's Leonard Arthur Vance. Arthur froze. The name reverberated through the luxurious office like a silent explosion. Leonard. Arthur repeated, his eyes narrowing. Your elder brother. The one your mother claimed was dead to the family. The one who walked away from the board 5 years ago. He's not dead. Julian spat, his fingers clenching into tight fists. He's been living like a dog in the industrial district. Running some pathetic, grease-stained auto shop on Sovereign Street. He did this on purpose. He knew exactly what the Montgomery merger meant to my position in the company. He stole her to destroy me. Arthur walked slowly to his desk, his heavy boots pressing deep into the Persian rug. He picked up a sleek black fountain pen, his mind moving with the cold calculation of a chess master. He didn't just steal her to destroy you, Julian. Arthur murmured. He stole her because he knows the legal framework of this city. A woman who is already legally bound to a Vance cannot be forced into a contract with another Vance. The merger clauses are locked until Vivian's legal status is resolved. Your brother just put a fortress around my daughter. Julian slammed his hand onto the desk, his composure entirely gone. Then we tear the fortress down, Julian shouted. I'll send 20 men to Sovereign Street. We drag her out of that grease trap by her hair and we handle Leonard permanently. No, Arthur said, his voice cutting through Julian's panic like a razor blade. You will do nothing of the sort. A public brawl on Sovereign Street will bring the federal regulators down on our shipping licenses. We do this legally. We do this systematically. We squeeze them until they have no air left to breathe. Arthur picked up his secure satellite phone, dialing a single-digit speed code. This is Montgomery, he said into the receiver. I want a full financial audit initiated on Sovereign Auto. Contact the city building inspectors. Tell them there are code violations on that property. Shut down their electricity if you have to. And put 3 teams on the perimeter. Nobody enters that garage. Nobody leaves. Let's see how long my daughter enjoys the life of a mechanic's wife when the lights go out. Back on Sovereign Street, the air inside the garage office was thick with the scent of old paper and dust. Vivian sat behind the small metal desk. A massive, leather-bound accounting ledger opened before her. She had spent the last 3 hours scanning rows of messy, handwritten numbers. Pop Jenkins' handwriting was a disaster of looping text and missing decimal points. But as she worked, her mind found a strange, comforting rhythm. For years, her father had told her she had no head for business, that her only job was to look beautiful at charity galas. But here, looking at the raw operational costs of Sovereign Auto, she saw the truth. The garage was bleeding money because of uncollected invoices. Dozens of local transport companies owed Leo thousands of dollars for fleet maintenance. They were taking advantage of his quiet, stoic nature. You're frowning, princess, a voice rumbled from the doorway. Leo was standing there, his massive frame blocking the light from the workshop. He had a fresh smudge of black grease across his left cheek, and his fitted black t-shirt was damp with sweat. Your accounts are a disaster, Leo, Vivian said, not looking up from the page. The Chevron transport line hasn't paid an invoice since February. You're running a charity, not a business. Leo walked into the office, leaning one large hand on the edge of the desk. The scent of cedarwood and raw iron rolled off him, hitting Vivian's senses. "The people who own Chevron are good people," Leo said quietly. "Their driver has a sick kid. I told them they could settle up when the season turned." Vivian finally looked up, her emerald eyes meeting his storm, gray gaze. "That's very noble," she said, her voice softer than usual. "But noble doesn't pay for the hydraulic fluid I saw on the inventory sheet. If you want to keep this fortress standing against my father, you need capital. You can't fight a billionaire with good intentions." Leo stared at her, a strange, intense look crossing his face. Before he could speak, the old landline phone on the desk rang with a loud, jarring shrill. Vivian jumped, her hand instinctively reaching for her chest. Leo reached across her, his arm brushing against her shoulder as he picked up the receiver. "Sovereign Auto," Leo said. He listened for 10 seconds, his face turning into a mask of pure, unyielding stone. "When?" Leo asked, his voice dropping into a deadly register. He slammed the phone down onto the cradle. "What is it?" Vivian asked, her heart beginning to race. Leo looked down at her, his eyes cold as flint. "The city just revoked our operational license," Leo said, "claiming an emergency environmental hazard with our oil disposal. And Pop just called from the parts warehouse downtown. 2 of your father's black SUVs just blocked him in the alley. The hunt has officially begun." The air inside the garage office felt suddenly compressed, suffocating. The heavy metal walls seemed to draw closer with every second that passed. Vivian stood up so fast her metal chair scraped grollantly against the concrete. The sharp sound echoed off the high rafters of the workshop like a gunshot. "They're going after Pop?" she asked, her voice tight with immediate guilt. Her emerald green eyes were wide, fixed entirely on Leo. "Has nothing to do with this. This is my fault. It's my father trying to draw me out. He knows exactly which buttons to push to make people suffer." She gripped the edge of the metal desk, her knuckles turning white. The realization that her bid for freedom was already dragging innocent people into the line of fire tasted like ash in her mouth. Leo didn't answer immediately. He stood perfectly still in the center of the office doorway, his large frame blocking the light from the workshop. His expression was a mask of unyielding stone. Then, without a word, he turned on his heel. He walked out of the office and straight to a heavy steel tool chest near the main bay. His movements were deliberate, methodical, entirely devoid of the frantic, disorganized panic that usually consumed the people in Vivian's world when an empire began to crack. He pulled open a deep drawer that groaned under the weight of solid iron tools. He reached inside and pulled out a heavy, forged iron tire iron. He tested its weight in his palm, a single, sharp flex of his forearm muscle rippling beneath his oil-smudged skin. Then, he slid it into the side loop of his heavy canvas work pants. "Pup knows exactly who I am, Vivian," Leo rumbled, his back still turned to her as he locked the tool chest. His voice was a low, vibrating baritone that seemed to cut through the hum of the remaining garage equipment. "He knew the risks when he let me buy into this shop 5 years ago. He knew what kind of ghosts followed the Vance name. He's not a victim. He's family." He turned around slowly, his storm gray eyes fixing onto her pale, determined face. The distance between them felt charged with an unspoken, heavy weight. "Stay inside the office," he commanded, his tone dropping into a flat, authoritative register. "Lock the door from the inside. There's a deadbolt on the frame. If anyone besides me or Pop tries to open it, use the heavy metal fire extinguisher behind the desk. Aim for the face and don't hesitate. Do you understand me?" Vivian looked at the iron tool slung at his hip. Then she looked at the immense, quiet fury vibrating through his massive frame. She didn't freeze. Instead, her chin lifted, her aristocratic posture returning despite the oversized flannel shirt she wore. "I'm coming with you," she said, her voice steady and clear. "No, you're not," Leo shot back, his gray eyes narrowing into two sharp slits of flint. "My father's men want me, Leo," she argued, stepping out of the office and walking right up to his chest. She had to tilt her head back to look into his eyes, but she didn't retreat an inch. "If they see you alone in that alley, they will use force. They will assume you're just a standard mechanic they can bully or break. But if I am sitting in that truck beside you, they have to answer to Arthur Montgomery before they touch a single hair on your head. I am your legal shield. Remember? That was the arrangement we signed at the courthouse. The contract goes both ways, Leo. You protect me from Julian, and I protect this shop from my father's corporate thugs." Leo stared down at her, his jaw clenching so hard that a sharp muscle jumped beneath his dark stubble. The proximity between them was suddenly electric. She could smell the raw sweat, grease, and faint scent of cedarwood clinging to his skin. She could feel the literal heat radiating from his massive chest, warming her against the chill of the damp garage. For a fraction of a second, his gaze dropped to her parted lips. A brief, heavy hesitation crossing his features before his eyes snapped back to her emerald green gaze. "You don't know the kind of men Julian employs, Princess," he murmured, his voice softening just a fraction, though the warning remained lethal. "They don't care about legal contracts in a dark alley when the cameras are off. They are paid to deliver results, not to respect the law." "I can handle my brother's goons," Vivian said, her voice dropping into a whisper that carried absolute certainty. "I've spent my entire life watching how they operate. Let's go get Pop." They took the matte, black tow truck. Its heavy diesel engine roared to life with a violent, smoky vibration that shook the entire frame of the vehicle. Leo threw the truck into gear, slamming his foot onto the accelerator as the heavy tires gripped the wet gravel of the driveway. The drive through the industrial district was a blur of gray brick buildings, rusted chain, link fences, and flashing traffic lights. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick, dark, and highly reflective under a suffocating, leaden sky. Vivian watched his profile in the dim light of the cabin. She noted the sharp, aristocratic nose hidden beneath the rugged exterior of a working man's dark stubble. She realized then that he was completely balanced between two entirely different worlds. He possessed the lethal corporate intellect and calculated cruelty of a Vance heir. But he also possessed the brutal, physical capability of someone who survived by his own hands on Sovereign Street. 10 minutes later, Leo swung the heavy tow truck into the narrow, brick-walled alleyway behind the parts warehouse downtown. The scene was exactly as Pop had described over the frantic phone call. Pop's faded blue pickup truck was completely pinned against a concrete loading dock. Two massive, immaculate black luxury SUVs were angled perfectly to block him from moving forward or backward. 4 men in tailored black suits and dark sunglasses stood around the perimeter of the blue truck, their hands resting casually inside their jackets, right over their holstered weapons. Pop Jenkins was sitting calmly inside his cabin, his faded baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, his grease-stained arms crossed defiantly over his steering wheel. He wasn't begging, and he wasn't running. Leo didn't slow the tow truck down as he entered the alley. Instead, he accelerated, angling the heavy steel reinforced bumper of the tow truck with terrifying precision. He slammed the brakes at the last possible second, the heavy tires screeching on the wet asphalt. The rear of the tow truck swung out, blocking the only exit of the narrow, brick alleyway with a loud, grinding crunch against the stone wall. The 4 security guards turned instantly, their expressions shifting from arrogant boredom to high alert. Leo threw his door open and stepped out before the heavy vehicle had even finished shaking from the impact. Leo shouted, his baritone voice booming off the narrow brick walls like a physical wave. "You all right?" "Just fine, son," Pop called back through his cracked driver's window, his voice steady. "These suits are just disrupting my morning schedule. Told Em I had an engine block to deliver, but they don't seem to care much about honest work." The lead guard, a tall, imposing man with a jagged scar tracking down the side of his neck, stepped forward. He recognized Leo instantly, his hand subtly shifting beneath his dark wool jacket toward the handle of his firearm. "Leonard Vance," the guard said, a smug, cold smirk appearing on his face. "Your brother wants a word with you, and Mr. Montgomery wants his property returned immediately. We can do this the easy way, or we can see how long it takes for someone to find you in this alley." Before Leo could take a step forward, the passenger door of the tow truck opened with a loud creak. Vivian stepped down onto the wet asphalt. Her oversized flannel shirt billowed slightly in the cold, damp wind. She walked directly to Leo's side, her emerald green eyes fixed entirely on the lead guard. She didn't look like an heiress right now, but she carried the absolute, unshakable authority of her bloodline. "I am not property," Vivian said, her high society clip cutting through the damp alley air like a sheet of ice. "And you are currently trespassing on private logistics space." The guards froze in unison, their eyes widening as they looked at the runaway bride they had been searching for all morning. The lead guard's smug smirk vanished in an instant, replaced by an immediate, tense hesitation. He knew the rules of engagement had just changed drastically. "Miss Montgomery," the guard said, taking a cautious half-step back. "Your father has ordered us to bring you home safely. The wedding guests are still waiting, and the contract needs to be finalized. My father has no legal jurisdiction over my life anymore," Vivian replied, crossing her arms over her chest. "I am legally married to Leonard Vance. The paperwork was filed and stamped by the municipal court at 8 o'clock this morning. Any attempt to move me, touch me, or disrupt this property will be treated as an interstate kidnapping by the Federal Transit Board. Because, as you know, my father's shipping licenses require absolute regulatory clean slates to operate in the international harbors. Do you want to explain to Arthur Montgomery why his entire commercial harbor fleet was grounded by federal marshals? All because you decided to touch his daughter on private property?" The narrow alley fell into a suffocating, heavy silence. The only sound was the steady, low idle of the diesel tow truck engine. The guards looked at each other, completely paralyzed by the corporate legal trap she had just laid out with surgical precision. They were trained to handle street thugs and frightened civilians. They were not trained to handle an elite heiress who knew how to leverage federal maritime law against their employer. Leo didn't waste the moment of their hesitation. He walked forward, his massive frame towering over the lead guard, until his shadow completely swallowed the smaller man. He didn't pull the iron tool from his hip loop. He didn't need to. The absolute, lethal certainty in his storm gray eyes was enough to freeze the guard's blood. "Move the vehicles," Leo whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised violence if ignored. "Now." The lead guard swallowed hard, a drop of sweat tracing down his scarred neck, despite the biting cold of the morning. His eyes darted from Vivian's fierce, unblinking glare to Leo's massive, curled fists. He knew they had lost this round entirely. The legal and physical leverage was simply too heavy to fight in a blind spot of the city. "Move on," the guard barked to his men, pulling his secure phone from his pocket to report the failure to Julian. The two black SUVs started up with a heavy growl, their reverse lights flashing red against the wet brick walls. They backed out of the narrow corridor slowly, clearing the path for Pop's pickup truck. Pop immediately threw his truck into gear, giving Leo a grateful, tight nod as he cleared the loading dock and drove past the tow truck. Leo watched the guards retreat until their tail lights completely vanished around the distant corner of the main street. Then, the heavy rush of adrenaline began to clear from the alley, leaving an intense, thick tension lingering between the two of them. Leo turned slowly to Vivian, his storm, gray eyes unreadable, dark, and filled with an emotion she hadn't seen yet. He stepped close to her, his massive shadow wrapping around her completely against the cold brick wall of the warehouse. "You shouldn't have done that," he murmured, his voice rough and low. "I just saved your mentor, Leo," Vivian said, her chest heaving slightly as the delayed shock of the confrontation finally hit her nerves. "I told you I could handle them myself," Leo said, his hand reaching out instinctively. His large thumb gently brushed a stray lock of dark brown hair away from her damp forehead. His touch was remarkably warm, calloused and rough from years of honest labor, sending a sudden, sharp jolt of raw electricity straight down Vivian's spine. They were standing inches apart in the damp shadows, their pluming breath merging together in the freezing air between them. The fake contract they had signed that morning at the courthouse suddenly felt incredibly thin, incredibly fragile against the heat rising between their bodies. "We need to get back to the shop," Leo whispered, his gaze dropping to her mouth again before he pulled his hand back with an effort of pure will. "The city inspectors will be at the gates by now. The war isn't coming anymore. Vivian, it's already inside the house." The drive back to Sovereign Street was completely silent. Neither of them spoke a word, but the silence wasn't cold. It was loaded with the weight of that brief touch in the alleyway. When the black tow truck pulled up to the gates of Sovereign Auto, Vivian's prediction proved entirely accurate. 2 city code enforcement vehicles were parked outside the main bay doors, their yellow lights flashing lazily against the industrial brick facade. A man in a crisp white shirt and a hard hat stood near the entrance, holding a digital tablet and a stack of official violation notices. Pop Jenkins was already there, standing near his truck with his arms crossed, arguing fiercely with a second inspector. Leo killed the diesel engine of the tow truck, the sudden quiet of the cabin making the flashing yellow lights outside look even more invasive. "Stay here," Leo said, his voice returning to his standard unbothered calm. "No," Vivian said, her fingers already unlocking the passenger door. "They are using municipal harassment. My father doesn't use weapons when he can use bureaucracy. I know how to speak their language, Leo." They stepped out of the truck together, the cold air hitting them as they walked toward the city officials. The lead inspector looked up from his tablet, his eyes scanning Leo's grease-stained clothes before locking onto Vivian. He stopped mid-sentence, his professional arrogance faltering slightly as he recognized the Montgomery features. "Mr. Vance," the inspector said, clearing his throat and adjusting his hard hat. "We've received an anonymous tip regarding an illegal hazardous waste discharge into the city transit lines from this facility. Under City Code Section 42, we are required to issue an immediate emergency suspension of your operational license, pending a full environmental audit that could take up to 90 days. Leo didn't flinch. He stood with his feet planted wide on his own concrete floor, looking down at the official. "I recycle every drop of oil through the certified state transit grid," Leo said flatly. "The manifest logs are in the office. You want to see them, or do you want to keep reading from the script my brother wrote for you?" The inspector's face turned bright red. "Sir, I am just performing a standard municipal directive. A directive initiated by a phone call from Montgomery International's legal counsel at exactly 9:15 this morning." Vivian interrupted. She stepped forward, her voice carrying the absolute weight of a boardroom executive. "My name is Vivian Vance. I am the co-owner of this property as of this morning. If you issue a suspension notice without a physical sample verification from an independent laboratory, you are violating the city charter's due process clause. Furthermore, I will personally file an injunction against your department for targeted administrative bias by 12 o'clock. We will name you individually in the lawsuit. Inspector, do you think the Montgomery family will pay your legal fees when you lose your pension for filing a fraudulent enforcement order?" The inspector stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked down at his tablet, then back at the fierce emerald eyes of the woman standing before him. He could see the absolute certainty in her posture, the same certainty that had broken seasoned executives in her father's past. He slowly lowered the tablet, turning to look at his partner. We can allow a 48-hour grace period for the manual submission of the manifest logs," the inspector muttered, backing toward his vehicle. "Please ensure the documents are delivered to the city office by tomorrow afternoon, Mrs. Vance." The use of her new name sent a strange, deep hum through Vivian's chest. Mrs. Vance. It sounded heavy, real. The two code enforcement vehicles turned around and drove away, their yellow lights finally turning off as they hit the main avenue. Pop Jenkins let out a loud, rough laugh from the back of the shop, shaking his head in pure amazement. "Well, I'll be damned, Leo," Pop said, walking over and patting Vivian gently on the shoulder with a clean hand. "You didn't just find a wife, son. You found a high-powered defense attorney disguised as a runaway bride. She just cleared out the city hall with nothing but a glare." Leo didn't laugh. He looked down at Vivian, his storm gray eyes intense, searching her face for any sign of regret. "They will be back tomorrow with something bigger," Leo said softly, his voice for her ears alone. "My father doesn't stop until the target is completely leveled." Vivian agreed, her emerald eyes meeting his steady gaze. "Then we build the walls higher tonight," Leo said. He turned toward the workshop, his large frame moving back into the dark shadows of the mechanics' bays. Leaving Vivian standing on the concrete floor, her heart beating with a strange, new rhythm that had absolutely nothing to do with fear. The 48-hour grace period was a ticking clock, and every tick echoed through the hollow spaces of Sovereign Auto like a gunshot. By 9 o'clock that evening, the industrial district had fallen into a heavy, dead silence. The surrounding warehouses were locked and dark, their chain-link fences casting long, jagged shadows across the empty avenues. Inside the garage, the only illumination came from a single, green-shaded desk lamp in the back office, and the pale, ghostly glow of an old desktop monitor. Vivian sat stiffly in the metal swivel chair, her fingers flying across the keyboard with sharp, rhythmic clicks. She had spent the last 5 hours completely rewriting the garage's financial history, organizing 5 years of messy receipts, scattered invoices, and half-forgotten ledger entries into a pristine, unassailable digital database. She was exhausted. The muscles in her neck were frozen into tight bands of tension, and her green eyes burned from staring at the glowing columns of numbers. But she refused to stop. Every organized file was another brick in the fortress she was building around her freedom. Every verified recycling receipt was a shield against the city inspectors her father controlled. She paused, rubbing her temples as she leaned back in the creaking chair. The silence of the garage was profound, broken only by the steady, muffled drip of oil into a pan somewhere in the dark bays outside. She looked toward the glass partition of the office. The workshop was a vast cavern of black iron and silent machinery, smelling heavily of rubber and rusted metal. Leo was out there somewhere. He had been silent for hours, retreating into the deep shadows of the back workspace after Pop had left for the night. Vivian stood up, her bare feet pressing into the cool linoleum of the office floor. She needed a break from the numbers. She needed to feel the physical reality of the space she had sacrificed her old life to inhabit. She stepped out of the office, the air of the main bay instantly wrapping around her shoulders like a cold shroud. She walked slowly, her eyes adjusting to the deep gloom, guided by the faint moonbeams filtering through the high, dirty skylights. As she passed the classic black muscle car Leo had been working on, her hand trailed along its smooth, cold fender. She noticed a faint gleam of light coming from the far corner of the garage, a part of the facility she hadn't explored yet. It was a small, heavy iron door marked, "Authorized personnel only" in faded, peeling paint. The door was slightly ajar, throwing a thin, golden sliver of light across the grease-stained concrete floor. Curiosity, sharp and undeniable, flared in Vivian's chest. She approached the door with silent, careful steps, her breath held tight in her throat. She pushed the heavy iron panel open just a fraction more, the hinges moving without a single sound, a sign they were meticulously oiled. The room inside was not a mechanic's workshop. It was a clean, dust-free sanctuary that looked entirely out of place on Sovereign Street. The walls were covered in large, high-resolution corkboards, pinned with complex architectural blueprints of advanced hybrid engines. Dozens of technical schematics, bearing the distinct watermark of Vance International, were lined up with mathematical precision. In the center of the room sat a massive oak desk, completely covered in thick financial portfolios, corporate bylaws, and global shipping ledgers. Sitting behind the desk, bathed in the sharp light of an analytical desk lamp, was Leo. He had traded his grease-stained overalls for a clean, fitted black long-sleeve shirt that emphasized the massive breadth of his shoulders. He was wearing a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses that gave him an aura of fierce, terrifying intelligence. His large, calloused fingers were turning the pages of a high-end corporate prospectus with absolute familiarity. Vivian gasped softly, the sound escaping her lips before she could stop it. Leo's head snapped up instantly, his storm gray eyes locking onto her through the wire frames with a lethal, defensive intensity that made her freeze. For a second, he looked exactly like the corporate executioners she had grown up avoiding. A Vance in his true element. Slowly, the defensive glare vanished from his features, replaced by his standard, stoic calm. He took off the glasses, tossing them onto the open prospectus with a dry sigh. "You're supposed to be organizing the manifest logs, princess," he said, his gravelly baritone quiet, but heavy in the small room. Vivian stepped fully into the room, her eyes darting from the blueprints to the corporate ledgers on the desk. "The manifest logs are finished," she said, her voice dropping into a lower register as she absorbed the revelation around her. "They are pristine. The city won't be able to touch us tomorrow." She walked closer to the desk, her finger pointing at a complex schematic of a variable, compression turbine engine. "But this isn't the work of a simple mechanic. Leo, these are foundational proprietary designs for Vance International's next generation commercial fleet. Designs that the corporate board claimed were lost when the lead engineer resigned 5 years ago." She looked up, her emerald eyes meeting his steady, gray. "You weren't just the heir who walked away because he hated the family money. You were the lead architect of the entire empire's technological future. You built the foundations of the very company Julian is trying to run." Leo leaned back in the heavy chair, crossing his powerful arms over his chest. The shadows cast by the lamp carved deep, harsh lines into his rugged face. "Julian didn't want to build anything, Vivian," Leo said quietly, the words leaving his lips with a cold, detached certainty. "He wanted to control things. He wanted the title, the penthouse, the applause of the shareholders. My mother Eleanor encouraged it because she knew she could manipulate Julian. She couldn't manipulate me. 5 years ago, they tried to force a signature on an international shipping contract that would have used our fleet to bypass safety regulations in the western ports. A contract that would have risked the lives of hundreds of dock workers for an extra 8% profit margin. I refused to design the vessels for that framework. So they tried to freeze me out of the board, using corporate maneuvers to strip my executive clearance. He looked around the clean room, a faint, cynical smirk touching his lips. They thought I would crawl back on my knees when the money stopped. But they forgot that I designed the patents under a private, independent subsidiary called Sovereign Engineering. A subsidiary that I legally moved out of their reach before they could lock the boardroom doors. I didn't lose the designs, Princess. I kept them. And for 5 years. I've been sitting right here on Sovereign Street, watching them struggle to build a future without the blueprints. Vivian felt a profound, heavy realization wash over her. The man standing before her wasn't just a shield. He was a weapon. A weapon that had been waiting patiently in the dark for 5 years, tracking every move his family made, waiting for the perfect moment to strike back. And then I ran into your garage. Vivian whispered, her heart hammering with a sudden, intense alignment of purpose. You didn't just accept my marriage proposal to annoy Julian. You accepted it because my father's logistics merger was the final piece of the puzzle Julian needed to bypass your patents. But marrying me, you didn't just stop my wedding. You stopped the entire global expansion of Vance International. Leo stood up slowly, his massive physical presence filling the small room, casting a long shadow over the blueprints pinned to the wall. He walked around the desk, stopping just inches away from her. The closeness between them was immediately suffocating, thick with the unspoken tension that had been building since the alleyway confrontation. I told you the first night, Vivian, Leo murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that reached deep into her chest. I don't play rich people's games unless I intend to end them. Your father and my brother think they can use the city hall to crush this shop. They think they are dealing with a simple mechanic who will break when the lights go out. But they don't know that the ledger in your hand contains the legal leverage to force a boardroom vote by the end of the month. We are partners in this, Princess, whether you like it or not. Vivian looked up at him, her green eyes wide, tracking the sharp angle of his jawline, the intense focus in his gray eyes. She realized then that she wasn't afraid of him. She was exhilarated. For the first time in her life, she wasn't being used as a pawn by a powerful man. She was standing shoulder to shoulder with one, executing a strategy that could tear down the very walls that had kept her caged. I like it just fine, Leo, she whispered, her voice steady and lethal. Let's show them what happens when the grease meets the gold. Leo stared down at her, a look of intense, genuine admiration breaking through his stoic features for the very first time. He reached out, his large, calloused hand resting against the wood of the desk right beside her waist, trapping her gently within his personal space. The scent of cedar wood and clean cotton rolled off him, heavy and warm. Go get some sleep, Vivian, he said softly, his voice dropping into a register that made her pulse race. Tomorrow, we deliver those manifest logs to the city. And then, we start pushing back. Vivian nodded, her breath shallow as she stepped around his massive frame, her body tingling from the sheer proximity. She walked back out into the dark garage, her mind spinning with 1,000 corporate strategies, 1,000 shifting variables. She climbed the creaking wooden stairs to the apartment above. The steady, rhythmic clicking of her laptop downstairs replaced by the sound of her own racing heart. She lay down on the thin mattress, looking at the ceiling, no longer feeling like a runaway hiding in the dark. She felt like an empress preparing for a rebellion. And downstairs, the light in Leo's secret office remained burning bright into the midnight hours, a beacon of silent, looming war against the empire that had cast him out. The smell of burnt coffee, stale grease, and industrial floor cleaner hung thick under the buzzing fluorescent lights of the Star Diner. It was exactly 6 o'clock in the morning. The shift workers from the surrounding shipping docks sat in quiet, wary rows along the heavy laminate counter. Their faces were weathered by decades of salt air and bitter winters. Their heavy leather work boots caked in dried mud and river silt. They didn't talk much at this hour. They just stared into their black coffee, waiting for the whistle to blow at the harbor. Vivian sat in the furthest corner booth, tucked away where the ambient light couldn't quite reach. Her back was pressed firmly against the cracked, patched red vinyl of the seat. She wore a heavy, faded denim jacket over her oversized flannel shirt. Her dark espresso brown hair was tucked entirely beneath a plain black baseball cap pulled low over her brow. Her hands were wrapped tightly around a thick ceramic mug, using the rising steam to warm her pale face and numb fingers. Across the scarred table sat Maya Lin. Maya looked entirely out of place in the gritty, industrial atmosphere of the diner. Her razor-cut jet black bob was sharp, framing an energetic, highly expressive face that radiated nervous tension. She wore an oversized black leather motorcycle jacket with heavy silver zippers that clinked softly every time she moved. Between them, hidden behind a tall stack of untouched breakfast plates, sat Maya's sleek, minimalist laptop. Its screen was dimmed to the lowest setting, throwing a cool, ghostly blue glow onto Maya's sharp brown eyes. "You're completely off the grid, Viv," Maya whispered, her voice a rapid, energetic clip that barely carried over the low hum of the diner's refrigerator. "Your father has 3 private intelligence firms checking every flight manifest leaving the country. They are checking the trains to Chicago. They are checking the luxury charter buses. Julian is telling the corporate board that you have a sudden case of exhaustion and are resting at a private clinic. They are putting up a flawless public front, but they are panicking behind closed doors. The logistics merger can't clear regulatory compliance until your signature is verified by a state notary. You haven't just run away from a wedding, Viv. You've frozen a $4 billion infrastructure deal. You've stopped an empire dead in its tracks." Vivian took a slow, deliberate sip of her bitter black coffee. Her emerald green eyes remained fixed on the glowing columns of data on the dimmed screen. "Good," Vivian said, her voice retaining its polished, unyielding edge despite the exhaustion vibrating through her bones. "Let them panic. They spent my entire life treating me like an asset on a balance sheet. They thought I was a line item they could transfer from one ledger to another without a fight. They are about to find out how expensive an uncooperative asset can be. I am not going back, Maya. Not to that house. Not to that man." Maya leaned forward, her heavy silver hoop earrings swinging as her expression turned deeply serious. "But Viv, who is this guy? Leonard Vance. I ran a deep digital scrub on the Vance family infrastructure last night using an old secure backdoor. 5 years ago, he completely vanished from the corporate registry. The public records say he died in a boating accident off the northern coast. The press releases were finalized. The board issued condolences. But he's running a gritty mechanics shop on Sovereign Street. He's dangerous, Viv. The Vances don't just walk away from billions of dollars without leaving bodies behind. He didn't walk away because he was weak. Maya, Vivian said softly, her eyes shifting to look out the rain-streaked window at the dark street. He walked away because he was too smart for them to control. A holds the master patents for the entire automated fleet system Julian is trying to build. Isn't just a mechanic who happened to be working late. He's the architect of the whole empire. He's the one who built the foundation they are trying to steal. Before Maya could reply, the small brass bells above the diner's heavy glass door jingled sharply. The casual, low-frequency murmuring of the dock workers at the counter ceased instantly. A heavy, cold draft of morning air swept across the floorboards, carrying the scent of damp pavement and exhaust. Two men stepped into the diner. Their large, muscular frames were clad in identical, immaculate charcoal wool coats. They didn't look like dock workers. They didn't look like truck drivers. Their eyes were sharp, cold, and calculated, scanning the booths with the clinical precision of trained wolves. Vivian felt her stomach instantly drop into a cold, hollow pit of pure adrenaline. Maya, Vivian whispered, her voice dropping to a flat, lethal register. Close the laptop. Now. Maya didn't ask questions. She slammed the screen down just as the lead investigator spotted the edge of Vivian's faded denim jacket. The two men moved instantly, their heavy leather dress shoes clicking deliberately against the hard linoleum floor. They surrounded the booth, blocking the narrow aisle and cutting off any possible path to the exit. The lead investigator, a thick, set man with a cold, pale face and a wireless earpiece glinting in his ear, leaned over the table. "Miss Montgomery," he said, his voice a low, threatening murmur that carried the weight of absolute authority. "Your father has grown tired of this game. The vehicle is waiting outside at the curb. We are instructed to bring you back to the estate immediately. Regardless of your objections. Regardless of your current company." Vivian didn't move. She kept her chin lifted, her emerald eyes flashing with a fierce, aristocratic defiance that had been bred into her bones. "I am a married woman," Vivian said, her voice clear and carrying perfectly across the quiet diner. "My name is Vivian Vance. You have no legal right to touch me on public property. If you lay a single hand on me, I will ensure your firm is stripped of its operating license by noon. My husband's lawyers will tie you to a federal deposition before the sun goes down." The second investigator sneered, stepping closer into the booth space. His large, heavy hand reaching out to grip Vivian's upper arm with a careless force. "We don't care about the license, lady," he hissed, his fingers tightening. "Move." Before his fingers could fully touch the fabric of her jacket, a massive shadow fell over the table. A devastatingly solid physical presence materialized from the gloom of the diner's entrance. A large, grease-stained hand clamped around the investigator's wrist. The grip was instantaneous, locking down with the terrifying force of a hydraulic industrial vice. The bone beneath the man's expensive sleeve made a sickening, faint creaking sound under the immense pressure. Leo stood there. He wore his heavy canvas work pants, a thick leather jacket slung over his broad shoulders, and heavy steel-toed boots. His charcoal black hair was damp from the morning mist, and his storm gray eyes were two pieces of jagged frozen stone. "I believe my wife told you to step back," Leo said. His voice was a deep, gravelly baritone that rumbled through the floorboards like a low-frequency earthquake. The diner went completely, terrifyingly silent. The investigator with the trapped wrist gasped, his face turning an immediate shade of bright crimson as he tried to pull away from the grip. He couldn't move an inch. Leo's hold was absolute, an immovable wall of raw, manual muscle that didn't give a single millimeter. The lead investigator stepped back into the aisle, his hand instinctively dropping inside his charcoal coat toward the handle of his concealed firearm. "Leonard Vance," the lead man growled, his eyes narrowing as he evaluated the threat. "You're interfering with a direct Montgomery directive. You don't want to do this here. This isn't your neighborhood, pal." Leo didn't look at the gun. He didn't look at the earpiece. He simply leaned forward, his massive frame completely eclipsing both men, casting a long, dark shadow that seemed to engulf the entire front portion of the diner. I don't care about Arthur Montgomery's directives, Leo whispered, his voice dropping into a deadly, quiet register that made the hairs on Vivian's arms stand up. And if you pull that piece out of your coat, I will take it from you. I will take it from you and feed it to you piece by piece until you choke. This is my district. These dock workers at the counter. They are my clients. They know my face. They know my work. And they don't like corporate suits coming into their space to threaten women. As if on cue, 4 massive truck drivers at the counter stood up slowly, their heavy frames turning around, their expressions dark and completely unyielding. One of them held a heavy iron tire iron loosely in his hand. Another held a large steel socket wrench, the tools catching the flickering fluorescent light of the ceiling. They didn't say a word. They didn't need to. Their loyalty to the man who kept their fleets running on Sovereign Street was absolute. The lead investigator looked at Leo's stone face. Then he looked at the wall of angry, massive dock workers surrounding the eisel. He realized instantly that the corporate boundaries of the city didn't apply here. In a blind spot of the industrial zone, a billionaire's money couldn't buy protection from a mechanic's fists. Leo slowly released the second man's wrist, tossing it aside like a piece of discarded scrap metal. The man stumbled back, cradling his bruised, swelling arm against his chest. "Get out of my diner," Leo commanded softly, the quietness of his voice far more terrifying than a shout. "And tell my brother Julian that if he sends another set of eyes to Sovereign Street, I won't just break their wrists. I'll come to the Vance headquarters myself. I'll come to the boardroom and handle him in front of the shareholders." The 2 investigators backed away slowly, their faces pale with a mixture of controlled rage, pain, and deep humiliation. They pushed through the heavy glass door, their charcoal coats billowing behind them as they retreated into the dark morning mist. The truck drivers nodded silently to Leo. A brief, mutual acknowledgement of respect before they returned to their coffee counter, as if the entire event had been nothing more than a minor disturbance. Vivian let out a long, shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands were still trembling slightly against the ceramic surface of the mug. She looked up at Leo, who was now standing over her booth, his rugged features slowly softening back into his standard, stoic calm. For the first time in her life, she didn't just feel legally protected by a document. She felt physically safe, truly safe, bound to a man who would tear down empires with his bare hands to keep her from being broken. Maya stared at Leo with her mouth wide open, her sharp digital intelligence completely stunned by the display of raw physical power. "Wow," Maya murmured, closing her laptop completely and sliding it into her bag. "Okay. I see why you married the mechanic. Viv. That is definitely an upgrade from Julian." Leo didn't look at Maya, his storm gray eyes fixed entirely onto Vivian's face, tracking the slight flush of adrenaline on her cheeks, ensuring she wasn't hurt. "We need to get back to the shop, Vivian," he said softly, his tone for her ears alone. "Julian knows exactly where you eat now. The perimeter is shrinking with every hour. We need to activate the final phase of the ledger before they lock the city down completely." Vivian stood up, her posture straight, her emerald eyes meeting his steady gaze with an unshakable, shared intelligence. "Let's go," she said. "The fortress is ready." The smell of diesel fuel and old paper always filled the back office of Sovereign Auto. But tonight, the air felt different. It felt tight, charged with a heavy, quiet frequency that made Vivian's skin tingle. She sat on the floor of Leo's secret room, surrounded by the towering oak desk and the blue, glowing blueprints. The manifest logs for the city inspectors were gone, approved and stamped by City Hall after her legal threat. But the real work was just beginning. In her lap sat a heavy, damaged leather binder, she had pulled from the bottom drawer of Leo's steel cabinet. It didn't contain mechanic invoices. It contained 5 years of private, independent financial transactions. Transactions stamped with a crest that belonged to the foundational era of the Vance Empire. Vivian's finger traced a line of numbers, her emerald green eyes widening as the pieces of the puzzle locked together. She wasn't just looking at patents. She was looking at a hidden repository of wealth. "You're digging too deep, princess." A voice rumbled from the doorway. Leo was standing there, his massive frame framed by the dim light of the main workshop. He had a clean gray shirt on, his charcoal black hair slightly damp from a wash, but his storm gray eyes were fixed on the binder. Vivian didn't look down. She closed the leather book with a firm, intentional thud. "You're not an exiled heir living on a budget, Leo," she said, her voice clear and sharp. "You didn't just keep the patents for the automated fleet when you walked away from the board. You kept the primary asset equity bonds. The bonds that Julian has been trying to recreate for years to secure his credit lines with the international banks. He can't merge his logistics company with my father's shipping because it doesn't actually own the underlying infrastructure. You do. Every single cargo ship Vance International operates is legally registered to Sovereign Engineering. To you." Leo walked into the room slow. Back to national bands. His heavy boots making no sound against the clean floor. He stopped near the edge of the desk, leaning his hip against the mahogany wood, looking down at her. The shadows cast by the green desk lamp carved deep, dangerous lines into his rugged jaw. "Julian thinks the empire is built on the building," Leo said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone. "He thinks if his name is on the front door of the penthouse, he owns the city. But an empire isn't built on concrete, Vivian. It's built on technology and contracts. When I left, I didn't take their cars or their luxury apartments. I took the blood of the company. The automated navigation algorithms that keep their vessels from crashing in the northern straits. Julian tried to hire engineers from Europe to reverse engineer my code, but they failed. So he came to your father. He needed Montgomery International's manual navigation teams to mask the fact that his automated systems are dead." Vivian stood up, her dark denim jeans stiff as she brushed the dust off her flannel shirt. She stepped close to him, the proximity instantly reigniting the electric tension from the diner. "Then the marriage wasn't just a shield for me, Leo," she whispered, her green eyes searching his face. "It was the trigger for your trap. By marrying me, you didn't just void Julian's contract with my father. You forced the international banks to audit Julian's asset registry before they can release the merger funds. They are going to find out he's running an empty shell." Leo stared down at her, a look of intense, genuine appreciation breaking through his stoic features. He reached out, his large, calloused hand resting gently against her jawline, his thumb brushing her cheek. The touch was warm, sending a sudden, powerful wave of heat crashing through Vivian's entire body. "I didn't plan for you, Vivian," Leo murmured, his voice dropping an octave, becoming rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. "I planned for a corporate war. I planned for lawyers and board votes. But when you ran into my garage in that shredded white dress, everything changed. You're not just a partner in a contract anymore. You're the center of it." Vivian's breath hitched in her throat, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. The fake boundaries they had established on the first night were completely gone, melting away under the heat of his gaze. She didn't pull away from his hand. She leaned into it, her fingers reaching up to grip his wrist. "Julian won't just back down when the audit hits, Leo," she whispered, her eyes locked onto his parted lips. "He will try to destroy everything you built here. He will try to destroy you. Let him try." Leo whispered against her skin. He leaned down, his massive frame enveloping her completely, his mouth closing over hers in a deep, passionate kiss. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a release of 5 years of isolated fury and days of suppressed attraction. It tasted of copper, rain, and absolute possession. Vivian wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. The garage, the storm, the looming corporate war. Everything disappeared into the dark warmth of the secret room. They were no longer an heiress and a mechanic executing a convenient arrangement. They were two forces of nature colliding in the dark, bound by a reality that money could never buy. An hour later, the quiet of the apartment upstairs was shattered by a sharp, vibrating buzz. Leo's secure phone on the bedside table lit up, casting a harsh blue glow against the wooden walls. Leo shifted, his large arm still wrapped protectively around Vivian's shoulders as she rested her head against his chest. He picked up the phone, his gray eyes narrowing as he read the encrypted text message. It was from Maya. Julian knows about the audit, Tom. He just called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning at 9. He's moving the voting schedule forward to strip your shares before the bank can verify the assets. They are playing dirty. Leo turned the screen off, his face hardening back into a mask of pure, lethal calculation. Vivian sat up, the sheet pulling tightly around her frame, her emerald eyes filled with immediate readiness. He's running out of time, Vivian said, her voice instantly returning to its polished boardroom tone. If he moves the vote forward, he can claim your absence is a forfeiture of your executive rights. Leo stood up, his powerful, muscular frame standing tall in the dim moonlight of the bedroom. He walked over to a heavy steel chest in the corner of the room, pulling a digital key from his pocket. With a sharp click, the lock released, the heavy metal door swinging open to reveal a pristine, black-tailored luxury suit. It had been tailored in London 5 years ago, untouched by grease, unstained by the reality of Sovereign Street. He wants a boardroom vote, Leo said, his voice low, gravelly, and entirely unyielding. Then I think it's time the true heir to the Vance Empire showed up to cast his ballot. Vivian looked at the suit, then at the man standing before her. The mechanic was gone. The prince had returned. I'm coming with you, she said, her chin lifting with absolute defiance. This is our war, Leo boned. Let's go finish it. The dawn of the final boardroom vote did not bring light. Only a sharp, freezing mist that rolled off the northern harbor. Crawl spaces between the industrial warehouses on Sovereign Street were choked with gray fog. Inside the small apartment above the garage, the quiet was absolute. Vivian stood before the small, fogged-up mirror in the bathroom, her fingers carefully smoothing down the collar of a crisp, dark charcoal blazer. Maya had spent the midnight hours sourcing the wardrobe, dropping it off in a silent handoff at the perimeter gate. It wasn't her wedding dress. It wasn't the oversized flannel shirt she had grown comfortable wearing. It was a high, end-tailored power suit, sharp-shouldered and midnight black. She looked at her reflection, her emerald green eyes cold, focused, and completely devoid of the fear that had chased her into the garage days ago. She was no longer running. She was preparing to invade. She walked out into the small living space, her heels clicking sharply against the worn linoleum. Leo was already standing by the small kitchen counter. The transformation was complete. The grease-stained canvas pants and the oil-smudged black T-shirt were gone. Standing there was Leonard Arthur Vance, the exiled prince of the city's largest corporate dynasty. The London-tailored black luxury suit fit his massive, muscular frame with terrifying precision. The crisp white dress shirt emphasized the sharp, dangerous angle of his jaw, now cleanly shaved. His textured charcoal black hair was neatly styled, revealing the aristocratic forehead of a natural leader. But his storm gray eyes hadn't changed. They were still two pieces of unyielding, frozen stone, carrying the brutal grit of Sovereign Street into the fabric of high society. He looked up as she entered, his gaze tracking from her sharp heels to her emerald eyes. The memory of the dark warmth of the secret room from the night before lingered heavily between them. A silent, powerful undercurrent that shifted the very air in the apartment. The boardroom at Vance Tower is on the 34th floor. Vivian. Leo rumbled. His gravelly baritone sounded different in a tailored suit. Cleaner, sharper, but no less lethal. Julian will have his personal security team at every entrance matrix. The moment our vehicle clears the underground garage, the alarm will trigger. Are you ready to walk into the teeth of the machine? Vivian walked right up to him, her posture perfectly aligned with his commanding height. She reached out, her pale fingers extending to straighten the silver silk tie at his throat. Her touch was steady, but her pulse raced as she felt the hard, solid muscle of his chest beneath the expensive fabric. Julian spent his life trying to prove he could buy my family's legacy, Leo, she whispered. Her green eyes locked onto his steady gaze. He thinks he's a king because he has a golden gavel. But he forgot that a king actually has to know how to hold the line when the fortress walls crack. Pock. Let's go take his gavel. Leo's large hand came up, his calloused fingers wrapping firmly over hers, holding her hand against his chest for one heavy, silent second. Let's go, he said softly. They didn't take the black tow truck today. Maya was waiting at the curb in a sleek, unmarked luxury sedan with dark, tinted windows. Her razor, cut jet, black bob was sharp under her leather jacket, her fingers tapping a frantic rhythm on the steering wheel. The drive across the city was a quiet, high, tension drift through the morning traffic. The skyscrapers of the financial district rose through the fog like giant concrete headstones. Vance Tower stood in the center, a monolith of blue glass and polished steel that dominated the skyline. Maya swung the sedan into the subterranean executive parking structure, bypassing the standard visitor gates with a cloned security badge she had coded at midnight. The tires squealed softly against the polished concrete floor as she parked in a dark corner bay near the private executive elevator. The meeting started 10 minutes ago, Viv, Maya said, turning around in her seat, her sharp eyes wide with adrenaline. Julian has already called for the initial quorum verification. They are reading the asset restructuring clauses right now. The moment the board votes to approve the Montgomery merger, your father's signature becomes legally activated through the corporate bypass. You have less than 7 minutes before the paperwork becomes irreversible. Leo threw his door open, his massive frame stepping out into the cool, shadowed air of the garage. He buttoned his charcoal suit jacket with a single, smooth movement. Keep the engine running, Maya, Leo commanded quietly. We won't be long. Vivian stepped out beside him, the sharp click of her heels echoing off the concrete pillars like a countdown clock. They walked shoulder to shoulder toward the private elevator lobby. 2 large security guards in tailored black suits and earpieces stood before the brushed, steel doors, their postures rigid. As Leo and Vivian approached, the lead guard's eyes widened in sudden, absolute shock. He recognized Leo instantly from the corporate archives, his hand instinctively dropping toward his belt to trigger the silent communication system. Mr. Leonard Vance. The guard stammered, stepping back. Sir, you are not authorized on the executive level. Before the guard's finger could touch the button, Leo stepped into his personal space. His massive physical presence completely eclipsing the guard against the stone wall. Leo didn't pull a weapon. He simply stared down into the guard's eyes with a lethal, quiet certainty that froze the man's blood. I am the eldest living heir of the foundational trust. Son, Leo whispered, his deep baritone vibrating with absolute authority. My clearance was signed by the founder before your agency was even hired. Step away from the biometric scanner before I make it a legal matter. The second guard looked at Leo's broad shoulders, then at Vivian's fierce, aristocratic glare. He slowly lifted his hands away from his belt, taking a full step back from the elevator panel. "Yes, sir," the second guard muttered, his face pale as he swiped his master keycard across the glowing scanner. The heavy steel doors slid open with a soft, expensive hiss. Leo and Vivian stepped inside, the mirrored walls reflecting their unified, lethal silhouettes as the elevator accelerated upward toward the 34th floor. The digital floor counter ticked up rapidly, the numbers flashing red against the chrome ceiling. 30, 31, 32. Vivian felt her heart hammering against her ribs, the sheer weight of the looming confrontation pressing down on her shoulders. She looked at Leo, whose profile remained as unyielding and immovable as the iron car lifts on Sovereign Street. He turned his head, his storm, gray eyes catching hers through the dim light of the cabin. "Hold the line, Vivienne," he murmured softly, his hand finding hers in the dark space between them, his grip warm, powerful, and completely centering her panic. "The fortress belongs to us now." The elevator chimed with a soft, clean bell as the doors slewed open into the opulent, mahogany-paneled lobby of the executive suite. The war had officially reached the top floor. The double doors of the grand boardroom did not just open. They shattered the silence of the 34th floor. The heavy mahogany panels slammed back against the polished stone walls with a violent, echoing crash. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, old paper, and immediate, collective panic. 14 board members sat in high, backed leather chairs around a massive glass conference table. At the head of the table stood Julian Vance, his golden gavel raised in mid-air, froze like a statue. Beside him sat Arthur Montgomery, his fingers locked around a heavy gold pen, his piercing blue eyes narrowing instantly. The entire room gasped in unison, a collective wave of shock rippling through the elite crowd. Standing in the doorway, framed by the cold morning light of the high-rise windows, was Leo. His broad shoulders filled the entire frame, his bespoke black luxury suit radiating an undeniable aura of absolute power. Beside him stood Vivian, her posture flawlessly straight, her emerald green eyes flashing with a fierce, triumphant light. "The meeting is adjourned, Julian," Leo rumbled, his gravelly baritone booming through the high ceilings. His voice carried the brutal, unyielding weight of Sovereign Street, straight into the heart of the empire. Julian's face turned a sickening, ghostly shade of white, his fingers trembling as he dropped the gavel onto the glass table. "Leonard," Julian stammered, his arrogant composure instantly fracturing into pure panic. You're dead. You have no legal standing in this room." "Security! Get these trespassers out of my boardroom." Nobody moved. The 2 security guards who had followed them up from the garage stood in the hallway, their heads lowered in absolute submission. Leo walked forward, his heavy dress shoes clicking deliberately against the polished marble floor. He didn't look at his brother. He looked directly at Arthur Montgomery, who remained seated, his face a hard block of stone. Leo slammed a sleek digital tablet onto the center of the glass table, sliding it directly into the path of the primary investors. 5 minutes ago, the international banking grid initiated a full forensic audit of Vance International's underlying assets, Leo said. His voice was calm, steady, and terrifyingly precise. "The automated navigation patents Julian used to secure your merger capital do not belong to this board. They are legally registered to Sovereign Engineering. To me. And because Julian has been using dead patents to mask his infrastructure failure, he has committed global securities fraud." The boardroom erupted into immediate, frantic chaos. 3 major investors stood up instantly, their faces twisted in shock as they scanned the digital files flashing on the screen. "What is the meaning of this?" Julian, one of the senior board members demanded, his voice shaking with corporate terror. Is this true? Do we not own the automated fleet system? Julian scrambled forward, his perfectly slicked hair falling across his sweating forehead as he tried to grab the tablet. It's a lie, Julian shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation. He's a mechanic! He's a nobody living in the slums! Arthur, tell them! Tell them the merger is still valid. Arthur Montgomery slowly laid his gold pen down onto the mahogany desk. He stood up, his solid, blocky frame commanding the room as he turned his piercing blue eyes onto his daughter. Vivian, Arthur said, his voice a cold, measured rasp that had controlled her entire life. You are playing a dangerous game. Your signature is required on this document to protect the family asset. Come to this side of the table right now, and we can forget this little rebellion ever happened. Vivian didn't take a single step back. She walked right up to Leo's side, her hand sliding firmly into his large, warm palm. Their fingers locked together, a unified front of iron and silk that completely dominated the corporate space. The rebellion is already over, Father, Vivian said. Her high society clip cut through the room like a razor blade. I am no longer an asset on your balance sheet. I am the co-owner of Sovereign Engineering. I am Vivian Vance. And as of this moment, Montgomery International's access to the Western shipping lanes is officially suspended. Because my husband just pulled the navigation codes for every vessel in your harbor fleet. Arthur froze, the final realization of his complete defeat hitting him like a physical blow. He looked at the digital screen, then at Leo's immovable, storm, gray eyes, and finally at the absolute defiance in his daughter's face. He realized instantly that he had lost everything. The merger was dead. The empire was fractured. Julian fell back into his leather chair, his hands covering his face as two uniformed federal officers stepped through the boardroom doors. Julian Vance, the lead officer announced, a pair of steel handcuffs gleaming in his hand. You are under arrest for corporate fraud and asset manipulation. The room watched in stunned, absolute silence as Julian was led away, his arrogance entirely replaced by the hollow stare of defeat. Arthur Montgomery looked across the glass table at Leo one final time, a slow, begrudging nod of respect crossing his aged features. He picked up his coat and walked out the side exit without saying another word, leaving the fortress to its rightful heirs. Leo turned slowly to Vivian, his rugged features breaking into a genuine, beautiful smile that completely melted his stoic mask. He reached out, his large hands gently cupping her face, his thumbs wiping away a single tear of pure emotional relief from her cheek. We did it, princess, he whispered, his voice rough with a deep, unshakable love. The cage is broken. You're free. Vivian laughed through her tears, throwing her arms around his neck, pulling his massive frame down into a deep, passionate kiss. The board members around them began to cheer, the investors applauding the return of the true heir to the throne. But neither Leo nor Vivian heard a single sound. They were entirely lost in each other, bound by a love that had been forged in grease and gold. Several months later, the sky above Sovereign Street was soft, clearing into a beautiful, bright sunset. The old brick facade of Sovereign Auto was gone, replaced by a massive state of the art facility called Vance and Montgomery Engineering. The grand glass windows reflected the glowing city lights, a symbol of a new global initiative that fused luxury with ethical technology. Pop Jenkins stood near the entrance, a crisp new baseball cap on his head, smiling widely as he watched the local truck drivers celebrate. Maya sat on the hood of a sleek new hybrid vehicle, her laptop open as she managed the global press releases for the company's launch. Standing near the main rolling bay door, looking out at the endless city skyline, were Leo and Vivian. Leo wore a clean black button-up shirt, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms, his hands clean but still carrying the memory of manual labor. Vivian stood beside him, her dark espresso hair flowing in the gentle evening breeze, her simple silver ring gleaming under the golden hour light. She rested her head against his broad shoulder, her fingers tightening around his arm, in a gesture of absolute certainty. "Funny," Vivian murmured, a soft smile touching her lips as she looked at the bustling garage floor. "What is?" Leo asked, his gravelly baritone rumbling warmly against her temple. She looked up into his intense, storm-gray eyes, her heart full of a peace she had never known before. "The best decision I ever made started as a desperate run into a dark alleyway." Leo laughed, a deep, genuine sound that echoed beautifully off the high rafters of their new fortress. "That's probably true, Princess," he whispered, leaning down to press a soft, lingering kiss against her forehead. "But around here, we don't look back at the storm. We just look at the future." The music from the opening ceremony played softly through the industrial district, carrying their story out into the wide, endless avenues. What had started as a marriage of convenience had become a partnership of equals. A runaway bride had found her strength. An exiled prince reclaimed his throne. A fake contract had become forever, and as the sun finally dipped below the horizon, casting a beautiful golden glow over Sovereign Street, Leo and Vivian turned toward the future together. Not because it was perfect, because it was theirs.